Warsaw, December 1932. Snowflakes drifted past the dim windows of the Polish General Staff's Cipher bureau, each flake settling softly against the frosted glass before melting away. Inside, the room breathed with the rhythm of ticking clocks, rustling papers, and a muted clatter of an experimental machine on a heavy oak table. 3 rotors turned in sequence, clicking with precise indifference, the mechanical heartbeat of Germany's pride, the Enigma. Around the table, the air smelled faintly of tobacco and ink. In the far corner sat a young mathematician, his pen hovering above a pad filled with numbers, permutations, and looping symbols. His name was Marian Rejewski. He wasn't a soldier or a spy, yet he was about to enter one of the most secret battles of the century. As the rest of Europe stared nervously at Hitler's rise, Rejewski leaned closer to the coded pulse of the enemy, searching not for armies, but for patterns. That night, he found one small anomaly, a mathematical whisper beneath the chaos of letters. It would be the first crack in what Germany believed to be an unbreakable wall of secrecy, a wall that, years later, would collapse not in Berlin, not in London, but right here, under a single desk lamp in Warsaw. In the early 1930s, Europe was a continent teetering on the edge of transformation. The wounds of the First World War had not yet healed, and yet the machinery of another, even greater conflict was already stirring. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, was rebuilding in defiance of international restrictions. Adolf Hitler had risen from political obscurity to national prominence, feeding his people promises of strength, order, and revenge. Behind these public spectacles of power, another quieter war had already begun, a war fought not with bullets, but with codes. Communications had become the nervous system of modern warfare, and whoever could protect their secrets or pierce the enemies would command the future of intelligence. At the heart of this silent struggle stood a curious device born in Germany, the Enigma machine. To the untrained eye, it looked like a typewriter mounted in a wooden box. But inside, a labyrinth of rotating electrical rotors, contacts, and plugboard wires created a staggering level of complexity. Each time a key was pressed, current traveled through multiple changing circuits, producing a new cipher letter every time. With over 100 quintillion possible combinations, even the most advanced minds of the time called it unbreakable. The German military adopted Enigma as its standard encryption system, convinced no enemy could possibly untangle its secrets. That confidence would soon become one of their most fatal illusions. While most major powers admired the German system from afar, Poland quietly decided to confront it head-on. The newly independent Polish state, reborn after 123 years of partition, understood better than most the value of information. Bordering both Germany and the Soviet Union, Poland was trapped between 2 giants, and neither could be trusted. The Polish General Staff's Cipher Bureau, known as Bureau Cifro, became the small nation's shield against invisible threats. In 1929, Colonel Guido Langer and his deputy, Major Maximilian Siezki, made an unusual decision. They turned away from traditional linguists and spies and instead sought mathematicians. If the enemy's code was born of engineering and logic, then logic would be its undoing. From a University of Poznan, 3 brilliant young graduates were quietly recruited: Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski. All 3 were in their 20s, trained in higher mathematics, and driven by a subtle blend of patriotism and curiosity. They were not told exactly what they would be working on, only that their country needed their intellect more than ever. When Rejewski first saw the Enigma machine, it was both mesmerizing and terrifying. He quickly realized that brute force, trying every possible combination, was hopeless. The only path forward was to think like the machine itself, to find order within its chaos. Poland's allies, particularly France, occasionally provided fragments of help. French intelligence had managed to obtain stolen documents from a German informant inside Enigma's production circle, small pieces of configuration tables, operator manuals, and rotor settings. But these fragments alone were not enough. Even with them, the code remained sealed. The British cryptologic establishment at that time, centered in Room 40's legacy, had looked briefly at Enigma, but deemed it impenetrable without insider data. Where the others saw impossibility, the Poles saw a mathematical puzzle. They began assembling what resources they had, intercepted radio traffic, scraps of documentation, and a few prototype machines, into one of the most disciplined analytical efforts in modern intelligence. By the end of 1931, Rejewski's notebooks were filled with permutations, substitution groups, and cycle diagrams. He began treating each Enigma signal as a mathematical function, a permutation of 26 letters. The challenge, he realized, was to map how the machine transformed these letters daily, as its settings changed according to a strict schedule. Every midnight, every operator across the Reich synchronized his rotors, producing a new Cipher landscape by dawn. Rejewski decided that if he could reverse engineer the structure of the machine mathematically, he would not need to guess at every key. He could simply predict how its internal wiring worked. It was an audacious idea, one that no intelligence agency in Europe had yet considered. In this modest Warsaw office, a revolution in cryptology was beginning, one rooted not in espionage or luck, but in logic itself. And as the winter of 1932 deepened, Rejewski's calculations began to hint at something extraordinary. The unbreakable machine might not be unbreakable after all. What remained was to transform theory into proof, a task that would soon draw in more minds, more risk, and more time than anyone could have foreseen. By the start of 1932, Rejewski's work had moved beyond mere speculation. He realized that the Enigma's strength, its constantly changing letter substitutions, also contained its weakness. Every morning, German operators would set their rotors to a new starting position based on daily key sheets, then send their first messages encoded with those fresh settings. But human operators, following strict routine, often repeated certain patterns or words. These repetitions became the faint fingerprints Rejewski needed. He began collecting thousands of such openings, organizing them by date, and using mathematical group theory to study how letters transformed under different wiring configurations. What had once been random letters now began to form predictable cycles, hidden rhythms inside chaos. Through endless nights in that cold Warsaw room, the young mathematician mapped the internal logic of Enigma. By late December 1932, his calculations revealed the actual wiring of the machine's 3 rotors, a discovery no spy, agent, or engineer had ever achieved. It was the moment when abstract mathematics defeated German military engineering. With this information, Polish engineers built their own functioning replica of the Enigma. For the first time in history, an enemy's unbreakable cipher had been reconstructed from scratch. It was a monumental achievement, and yet the world never noticed. Soon, Rejewski was joined by 2 equally brilliant colleagues, Jerzy Różycki, whose flair for linguistic intuition complemented Rejewski's mathematical discipline, and Henryk Zygalski, whose inventive mind would later produce ingenious tools for code breaking. Together, they refined the process of deciphering daily Enigma messages. Instead of starting each morning from zero, they developed systematic methods, rotor catalogs, mathematical tables, and early mechanical aids that cut analysis time dramatically. Their work transformed cryptology from an art into a science. But even as their success grew, so did the complexity of their adversary. The German military, unaware of the Polish breakthrough, continued improving Enigma. They added more plugboard connections, increased the number of possible rotor selections, and later introduced new rotors altogether. Each modification expanded the machine's potential combinations exponentially. Yet, each time the cipher changed, the Polish team adapted. When Rejewski's equations alone were no longer enough, Zygalski proposed a new method, creating sets of perforated sheets that could reveal patterns by overlaying them in specific combinations. This analog innovation, though primitive by later standards, was a marvel of creativity. It allowed the Poles to find daily keys even as Enigma evolved. To manage the enormous workload, the Bureau Cipher built special mechanical aids they called bombas cryptologiques, or cryptologic bombs. These were not weapons, but automated electromechanical analyzers designed to test rotor positions faster than humans could calculate. The Polish bomba became the conceptual ancestor of the later British bomb, credited to Alan Turing. Decades before Bletchley Park reached operational scale, these modest machines in Warsaw were already fighting the first invisible battles of World War II. Outside their hidden office, Europe was drifting toward disaster. In 1933, Hitler consolidated power, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations, and military expansion accelerated. Radio traffic increased, encryption tightened, and Polish analysts worked under mounting pressure. They had no illusions about what was coming. Each intercepted message carried both technical value and a grim reminder. The enemy was preparing for war. Within this growing tension, the Polish mathematicians' work became their nation's most closely guarded secret. Even within their own government, few knew the scope of their success. By 1938, however, the Germans altered Enigma's internal design again, adding 2 new rotors and changing key procedures. The Polish system, once perfect, began to fall behind. They needed help, more machines, more manpower, more resources. And so, reluctantly, they prepared to share their discovery. In July 1939, just weeks before the first bombs fell on Poland, representatives from the French and British intelligence services were invited to a secluded meeting south of Warsaw, in a place called Pyry. There, under strict secrecy, the Poles revealed everything. The replica Enigma machine, the decoding methods, the perforated sheets, the rotor catalogs, and the mathematical foundation that made it all possible. Britain and France were stunned. What they had struggled to approach for years, the Poles had quietly mastered in less than a decade. That meeting would alter the course of the coming war. As Germany prepared its invasion, Poland had already armed its allies with the key to the Reich's most guarded secret. From that small room in Warsaw, the chain of events leading to Bletchley Park and eventually to the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic had begun. The story of the Enigma breakthrough is often told as a tale of machines, but at its core, it was a deeply human struggle. Inside that cramped cipher room, 3 young men lived under constant silence and secrecy. Marian Rejewski, quiet and meticulous, spent entire days surrounded by numbers scrawled across notebooks and chalkboards. His concentration was so intense that colleagues described him as hearing only the rhythm of his own thoughts. Jerzy Różycki, in contrast, brought energy and intuition, a sense of how people, not just machines, behaved. He often predicted operator habits or small procedural errors that became crucial to uncovering keys. Henryk Zygalski, the innovator of the group, blended patience with mechanical curiosity, sketching solutions longhand before turning them into physical tools. Together, they formed a triangle of intellect that operated without rivalry or fame. They were not heroes of the battlefield, but of endurance, men who waged their war in silence while the world remained unaware that the fate of nations rested on their pencils and wires. On the technological front, their ingenuity was nothing short of revolutionary. The Polish bomba cryptologiczna, first constructed in 1938, was a direct answer to Germany's increased complexity. Built at the AVA Radio Manufacturing Company in Warsaw, the device contained 6 Enigma rotor sets wired to simulate multiple possible positions simultaneously. Each bomb could run through thousands of settings automatically, dramatically accelerating what once took human teams hours or days. It was, in effect, an early computing machine designed not to calculate numbers, but to search logic spaces. Alongside it came Zygalski's perforated sheets, thin translucent papers with holes arranged in patterns corresponding to Enigma letter alignments. When overlaid, the correct combination of holes would align to reveal the day's key. This analog method was as brilliant as it was fragile. Each sheet had to be drawn, cut, and aligned by hand, requiring almost artistic precision. These inventions represented humanity's first organized mechanical assault on modern encryption. But none of it would have existed without leadership that dared to take intellectual risks. Colonel Guido Langer and Major Maximilian Rejewski of the Polish Cipher Bureau made the bold decision to trust mathematicians over traditional code clerks. At the time, most military intelligence departments across Europe were dominated by linguists, cryptographers, and former spies. Poland's choice to involve abstract mathematicians was seen as radical, even reckless. Yet Langer's instinct proved prophetic. Under his guidance, the Bureau shielded the young team from bureaucratic pressure, allowing them to work independently and in complete secrecy. They operated without interference, without the noise of military hierarchy. Langer often reminded them that their results could determine the survival of a nation, but he never demanded haste, only accuracy. That calm, deliberate approach became Poland's invisible weapon. Outside Poland, few believed such an effort could succeed. German intelligence considered their communications secure beyond question. Their officers relied on Enigma with near-religious confidence, transmitting daily orders for troop movements, supply logistics, and diplomatic correspondence. The Wehrmacht believed that even if a single message were intercepted, it would be useless without the daily key, and by the next day, the code would change entirely. This arrogance, combined with mechanical pride, became their blind spot. They never imagined that across the border, in a country far smaller and poorer, a handful of mathematicians had already undone the very foundation of their system. The human, technological, and leadership angles converged on one unshakable truth. Genius, discipline, and courage can thrive in obscurity. What began as a government experiment had evolved into a quiet revolution, one that would soon be tested as Europe plunged into war. From the German perspective, the Enigma machine was more than a communications tool. It was a symbol of national ingenuity. Officers of the Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine believed their cipher to be mathematically impregnable. They trained operators to follow strict key schedules and procedures, confident that their encrypted orders traveled across Europe unseen. Yet this confidence bred carelessness. Operators often reused keys, repeated predictable phrases like weather reports or salutations, and occasionally failed to randomize rotor positions correctly. These small human errors became the cracks through which the Polish cryptologist's pride opened the German armor. The more the Germans trusted their technology, the more vulnerable they became to those who understood the patterns beneath the illusion of complexity. When the Polish Cipher Bureau realized the full scope of their achievement, they faced an impossible decision, whether to guard their discovery in silence or share it with allies who had once dismissed them. The choice came in July 1939 at the now historic meeting in Priory Forest near Warsaw. Representatives from Britain's government code and Cipher School and France's Duxine Bureau were led through a small villa, unaware of what awaited them. On a long wooden table lay the fruits of 7 years of secret labor, a fully functional Enigma replica, recreated entirely from mathematics, along with decoding sheets, wiring catalogs, and mechanical aids. The French and British delegates were stunned. Until that moment, they believed the German cipher was unsolved. Now they realized that the Polish team had been reading portions of German military traffic for years. It was an extraordinary act of trust. Poland, standing on the brink of invasion, was handing its greatest secret to nations whose support it desperately needed. That meeting changed the trajectory of Allied intelligence. Within weeks, war erupted, and Poland fell under German occupation. But the knowledge shared at Priory did not vanish. The materials and methods were smuggled to France, where surviving Polish cryptologists continued their work under the name P.C. Bruno. Later, the intelligence was transferred again to Britain, where it formed the foundation of Bletchley Park's operations. When Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman began developing their improved British bomb, they started not from scratch but from Polish logic and design. The silent hand of Rejewski and his colleagues guided the first Allied victories in the invisible war of signals. Yet the moral dimension of their story is perhaps the most poignant. For decades, the world credited the British alone with cracking Enigma. The Polish contribution was buried beneath layers of wartime secrecy and post-war politics. Poland's occupation, the Iron Curtain, and Cold War narratives obscured its early triumphs. Rejewski lived much of his life in quiet anonymity, working as an accountant after the war, rarely speaking of his wartime role. Zygalski and Różycki shared similar fates, their names absent from most Western accounts until long after their deaths. Recognition came slowly, piece by piece, as classified files were released and historians traced the origins of Bletchley's success back to that modest office in Warsaw. It was a reminder that history often celebrates the visible victors while the silent pioneers fade into obscurity. Still, their legacy endured, not in medals or monuments, but in every encrypted message that was intercepted and deciphered throughout the war. Each decoded German order, each convoy rerouted, each life saved through foreknowledge of the enemy's moves owed something to those three Polish mathematicians and the visionaries who believed in them. Their invisible victory had already changed the course of intelligence before the first Allied soldier ever landed on European soil. By the winter of 1938, tension pulsed through every corridor of the Polish Cipher Bureau. Germany's military buildup was no longer a secret. Radio traffic was multiplying, and the Enigma machine was changing faster than ever. New rotors, additional plugboard connections, and revised operating procedures had pushed the cipher's complexity beyond the limits of Poland's existing methods. Rejewski and his team were still deciphering messages, but the time required had grown dangerously long. Each delay meant potential loss of critical intelligence. The race against time had begun. The mathematicians worked with a sense of desperation, knowing that if war came, as it surely would, their small office might not survive to continue the fight. In those last months before the outbreak of World War II, the Polish cryptologists decided to take their greatest gamble. They would reveal everything to their allies, not out of pride, but survival. If Poland fell, the knowledge had to live on. In July 1939, Colonel Guido Langer and Major Maximilian Siezki arranged a secret meeting in the dense pine forests near Pyry, just outside Warsaw. The participants arrived discreetly, their cars covered in dust from the narrow country road. Among them were Gustave Bertrand of French intelligence and Commander Alastair Denniston from Britain's government code and cipher school, accompanied by his mathematician Alfred Dillwyn Knox. None of them expected what they were about to see. Inside a small wooden villa, the Poles unveiled the secret that had consumed 7 years of effort. On the table stood an exact, working replica of the German Enigma, built from Polish engineering and mathematical deduction. Langer explained how Rejewski had reverse-engineered the machine's wiring, how Różycki had developed statistical shortcuts, and how Zygalski's perforated sheets could expose daily keys. They demonstrated the Bomba Cryptologiczna, their mechanical tool for testing rotor settings automatically. To the astonishment of their guests, the Poles then deciphered an actual German message in front of them. What had seemed to the world an unbreakable mystery was suddenly rendered transparent in a matter of minutes. The British and French officers were overwhelmed. Until that moment, both nations had struggled even to understand the basic mechanism of Enigma. Now they realized that a small country, one facing imminent invasion, had quietly achieved what their larger intelligence services had deemed impossible. For Poland, this was more than a technical demonstration. It was a plea for unity before the storm. Langer made it clear. If war came, they would need their allies to continue what Poland had started. The British delegation promised to carry the work forward, but no one in that room could know just how soon the need would come. Barely 6 weeks later, on September 1st, 1939, German tanks rolled across the Polish border. Luftwaffe bombers roared over Warsaw. The Cipher Bureau, hidden in the outskirts of the city, received orders to evacuate. Rejewski and his colleagues packed what they could, cipher materials, replica enigmas, and documentation, into crates and fled south toward Romania. They traveled under constant threat, often moving by night, passing checkpoints and bombed rail lines with forged papers. Behind them, the city burned, and the office that had once changed the course of code-breaking history was reduced to rubble. Yet their greatest weapon, knowledge, survived. When they reached France, the Polish cryptologists regrouped under French intelligence supervision at PC Bruno, a villa near Paris. There, they continued to decrypt portions of German traffic throughout the early months of the war. For a time, their work bridged the gap between the chaos in Europe and the quiet laboratories of Britain. Each message they intercepted and deciphered reminded them that their homeland was occupied, their families scattered, yet their fight, the intellectual war against Enigma, was far from over. The methods born in Warsaw now flowed westward, crossing borders and languages, carrying with them the seed of what would become the most powerful intelligence operation of the entire conflict. As the Polish cryptologists settled into exile in France, the center of the code-breaking effort began to shift westward. In Britain, the newly established government code and Cipher school had moved to a quiet Victorian estate called Bletchley Park. There, a team of linguists, mathematicians, and engineers worked under tight secrecy to exploit what the Poles had given them. The files, diagrams, and machine models smuggled out of Poland became the foundation on which Alan Turing, Gordon Welchman, and their colleagues built the next stage of the assault on Enigma. When Turing arrived at Bletchley in September 1939, he did not begin from zero. He began from Rejewski's logic. The Polish bomba cryptologiczna inspired his concept of a larger, faster electromechanical device, the British bomb, designed to handle the increased complexity of German communications. The same mathematical principles, permutations, cycles, and rotor logic guided every wire that would soon hum within the machines housed at Bletchley. Throughout 1940, the battle for information intensified. As German divisions swept across Western Europe, intelligence became the most valuable weapon Britain possessed. The Luftwaffe's encrypted communications, once beyond reach, now began to yield their secrets. Each message broken revealed formations, supply lines, and air raid plans, information that would later prove decisive during the Battle of Britain. But success was not immediate. The work at Bletchley was relentless, day and night. Machines clattered in long corridors, operators monitored thousands of intercepts, and mathematicians refined the logic inherited from Warsaw. What had started as Rejewski's theoretical equations now powered an industrial-scale intelligence network. Each deciphered signal was a silent blow against the Nazi war machine. Meanwhile, the Polish cryptologists continued their own work in France under increasingly difficult conditions. They operated from PC Bruno, near Paris, in collaboration with French and British liaisons. Communication between PC Bruno and Bletchley Park remained crucial. Polish expertise often solved key-setting problems that baffled others. But the German advance into France in 1940 forced another desperate escape. Rejewski and Zygalski narrowly evaded capture as the Wehrmacht approached. They carried what they could to southern France, later joining the Cadix Center in the unoccupied zone, where operations resumed under extreme secrecy. There, even as war consumed Europe, they continued deciphering messages, maintaining the fragile chain of continuity between the first breakthrough and the Allied intelligence machine that now depended on it. At Bletchley, the turning point came in 1941 when the flow of decrypted messages, codenamed Ultra, reached maturity. For the first time, Allied commanders had near real-time insight into German operations. Convoy routes, submarine deployments, and battlefield orders were intercepted and read before the enemy could act. The effect was transformative. Merchant ships avoided U-boats, bombers targeted precise positions, and entire offensives were blunted before they began. Behind every victory lay a paper trail of ciphered orders stripped bare by mathematics and machines. Yet amid the triumph, the origins of this intelligence miracle remained buried under layers of secrecy. Few at Bletchley Park knew how much of their success rested on Polish foundations. Rejewski's equations had become institutional memory, absorbed and expanded, but his name was seldom spoken. Wartime necessity demanded silence. Credit would have to wait. What mattered was survival of the Allies, of Europe, and of the very idea that reason could defeat tyranny. By the time the tides of war began to turn, the quiet work begun in Warsaw had matured into one of the most decisive intelligence efforts in modern history. The Polish cryptologists, scattered and often in hiding, never witnessed the full impact of their discovery. But every decoded message, every intercepted transmission, was an echo of that first moment in 1932 when Marian Rejewski had found a pattern where others saw chaos. The invisible front they had opened was now shaping the outcome of the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. When the guns finally began to fall silent over Europe, the echoes of the hidden war still reverberated through every intelligence office. The Allied triumph had many faces: generals, soldiers, and industrial workers, but behind them all was an invisible army of mathematicians, linguists, and engineers who had fought a different kind of battle. The Enigma code, once the cornerstone of German military confidence, was now a shattered relic. What began in a modest Warsaw office had grown into a vast network of cryptologic warfare that spanned from London to Cairo. The Polish cryptologists, though displaced and scattered, had helped build the foundation upon which the Allies' intelligence victory was constructed. The practical results of their early work were beyond calculation. By 1941, ultra-intelligence, derived from the continuous decryption of German signals, had become the Allies' single greatest strategic advantage. Intercepted Enigma traffic exposed U-boat movements across the Atlantic, allowing convoys to evade deadly ambushes and saving countless lives. In North Africa, intercepted orders revealed supply lines and battle plans that enabled British forces to anticipate Rommel's maneuvers. Even in the skies, the decrypted Luftwaffe communications played a critical role in directing radar defenses during the Battle of Britain. Each success was an unseen echo of the Polish discoveries from 7 years earlier. The logic of Rejewski's permutations, the precision of Zygalski's sheets, and the foresight of Langer's leadership lived on inside every British bomb machine humming at Bletchley Park. Yet, for the men who started it all, victory came at a personal cost. Poland had been destroyed twice, first by the Germans, then consumed by Soviet occupation. Returning home was impossible. Many of the Cipher Bureau veterans lived in exile, moving between France, Britain, and later, the United States. Rejewski and Zygalski eventually returned to post-war Poland, only to find their homeland under communist rule. They were forbidden to speak of their wartime work. To the state, their connection with Western intelligence was politically dangerous. For decades, their achievements remained classified, their heroism buried under silence. In the meantime, official history began to solidify around a single narrative that British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had cracked Enigma. While the contribution of Alan Turing, Gordon Welchman, and others was undeniably monumental, the story's beginning had been erased. The Polish names were absent from documentaries, speeches, and schoolbooks. Różycki, who had tragically died in 1942 when his ship was torpedoed in the Mediterranean, never lived to see even a fraction of the recognition he deserved. Zygalski lived quietly as a teacher in England, his students unaware that the man lecturing them on mathematics had once helped change the course of history. Rejewski, too, worked in obscurity, first as an accountant, later in minor clerical jobs, rarely speaking of what he had done, even to his family. Still, their invisible legacy endured in the very infrastructure of post-war intelligence. The Allied experience of code-breaking inspired the creation of centralized intelligence agencies like GCHQ and the NSA. The machines, methods, and mathematical frameworks developed from the Polish breakthrough became the blueprint for the digital encryption and decryption systems that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. Without Rejewski's theoretical groundwork, modern cryptography might have evolved decades later. Even the concept of a computing device built to test logical possibilities owed much to those early wartime experiments. The cost of secrecy was heavy, but in time, truth began to surface. As files were declassified in the 1960s and 1970s, historians pieced together the forgotten Polish chapter. Suddenly, names that had been buried reappeared in academic papers, intelligence archives, and military retrospectives. The myth of Enigma's single-point breakthrough gave way to a richer, more accurate story, one of international collaboration born from desperation, faith, and mathematics. Recognition, when it finally came, arrived slowly and far too late for many of those who had earned it. In 1973, declassified documents from Britain's government code and Cipher school finally confirmed what had long been rumored among historians: that Polish mathematicians had solved the Enigma long before the war began, and that without their work, the Allied code-breaking effort might never have succeeded. Newspapers in Britain, France, and Poland published belated tributes, and surviving members of the Cipher Bureau were quietly honored by various governments. For the first time in decades, the world began to understand that the origins of Ultra, the most secret Allied intelligence source, could be traced back not to Bletchley Park, but to a modest room in pre-war Warsaw filled with chalk dust and cigarette smoke. Still, the long shadow of politics continued to obscure full justice. During the Cold War, Poland's communist authorities remained reluctant to glorify heroes whose most significant wartime collaborations had been with Western powers. Rejewski and Zygalski, though finally acknowledged by some Western historians, lived modestly until their deaths, their contributions recognized more by scholars than by the public. It was only after the fall of the Iron Curtain that their names began to take their rightful place in the annals of modern intelligence history. Memorials were built in Poland. Streets and schools were named in their honor. In 2000, the British government issued an official statement acknowledging the essential role of Polish cryptologists in the defeat of Nazi Germany. It was a gesture of gratitude, decades overdue but deeply meaningful. The release of documents and memoirs in the 1990s and 2000s revealed even more of the truth. Historians found that the Pyre meeting of July 1939 had been one of the most consequential intelligence exchanges in the history of warfare. Without that meeting, the British might have spent years reconstructing what the Poles had already done, delaying code-breaking efforts that would later shorten the war by an estimated 2 years. Cryptologic experts around the world came to see Rejewski's mathematical reconstruction of Enigma as one of the greatest intellectual feats of the 20th century, a fusion of pure theory and practical engineering that laid the groundwork for computer science itself. Today, replicas of the Polish Enigma and the Bomba Cryptologiczna stand in museums across Europe, silent tributes to the ingenuity and perseverance of those who once worked in secrecy. Each exhibit tells a simple truth. Before Bletchley Park, there was Warsaw. Before Turing's machines, there was Rejewski's pen. The Allied victory in signals intelligence was not the work of one nation, but the culmination of a shared struggle against tyranny, one that began long before the world even realized a war was coming. In the quiet of history's reflection, the Polish contribution stands as a testament to the power of intellect over force, reason over brutality, and collaboration over isolation. The men who cracked Enigma were not warriors in the conventional sense. They fought with logic and equations instead of rifles, but their victory was every bit as decisive. And though time had nearly erased their names, history ultimately remembered. From the ashes of war, the truth resurfaced, clear and undeniable. It was a handful of forgotten Polish mathematicians who first pierced the darkness of Germany's most secret code, lighting the path that led the Allies to triumph. In the calm that followed the war, and later the Cold War's end, historians began to see the story of Enigma not merely as a technical triumph, but as a parable of human cooperation. What began in secrecy and silence became one of the most extraordinary examples of intellectual unity in the face of tyranny. The Poles, working under threat of annihilation, did not seek glory. They sought to protect civilization itself from descent into darkness. Their decision to share everything, their methods, their machines, their discoveries with Britain and France in 1939 was an act of faith as much a strategy. It proved that even in the most fractured moment in European history, the courage to collaborate could alter destiny. The Enigma story reminds the modern world that victory in war is not only won by those on the battlefield, but also by those in quiet rooms, surrounded by nothing but numbers and conviction. Marian Rejewski and his colleagues embodied a kind of heroism rarely celebrated, the courage to think when others were afraid to imagine. Their mathematical precision saved lives they would never know influence decisions they would never hear, and shape technologies that would define the future. The entire age of digital encryption and computer logic owes a quiet debt to their discipline and insight. Today, when their names are finally spoken alongside Turing, Welchman, and others, it restores a sense of balance to history. It reminds us that intellect knows no borders, and that even the smallest nation, armed with vision and intellect, can change the course of world events. As we look back on those flickering lights and whirring rotors, it is not just the sound of machines we should remember, it is the sound of determination, of minds refusing to yield. From that small office in Warsaw came not only the first crack in the Enigma, but a message that still resonates, that truth, logic, and cooperation remain humanity's most unbreakable code.